everyone, Anna here, and I have a very special 20-minute painting demo for you today. It features a sunlit early morning scene at the Oregon coast with rocks and the ocean and even a little sailboat in the background, and we're going to do it all in 20 minutes. And I'm going to show you how. So grab your paints and your brushes and follow along. All right, let's talk about brushes. I've got a Signet by Robert Simmons 4 bristle brush. This is a long flat. I've got a small Treacle Legion 9100 round, size 0. And then I've got a Silver Unlimited Sable Cat's Tongue. These are expensive, but they are fabulous brushes. And this one is a size 4. And then I've got a Rosemary Co Series 77 Pure Sable, and this is a short flat. And I'll be using all 4 of these today. And then as I lay out my paints for today, keep in mind I'm going to use a very limited palette. I get a lot of comments from people saying, why do you use such expensive brands? And the truth is, I just think they're better. But these are colors that are very accessible to anyone. You do not have to buy the same brands as what I'm using here. And so even though you see me using some Michael Harding, some Vasari, Sennelier, you can buy these colors in just about any brand and they're going to be fairly similar. So what I've got is ivory black, and then I've got ultramarine blue, titanium white, cadmium yellow light, or cadmium yellow pale. And then this is the warm gray from Utrecht. I love this color. It's actually very affordable as well. I don't know of an alternative color that would match it exactly in a different brand. But Utrecht is very affordable, so you can check that out. And then I've got burnt sienna here, also available from just about any brand, and it will do the job. So that is what we're going to use today for paints. Hey, and before we get started in the demo, I just wanted to let you know I ended up doing this painting 3 different times and had a number of technical issues during the filming. So you're only going to see a few shots of my palette for the first half of the demo. And it's a slightly different palette than what I used for the actual painting, but all the same colors, I just laid them out a little bit differently. And then once you get to about the 12-minute mark, you'll see my palette come back and everything is restored. So there's still plenty of great information in here. Keep watching to the end, it is definitely worth it. So I have a plan, and I think where people run into trouble with these speed paintings is that too often we go into something without a plan. We're just kind of like, okay, I'm gonna wing it, see what happens. Well, the best paintings out there look like they were done that way, but they were actually very well thought out from start to finish. And so it's really, really important to go in with some kind of plan, knowing how you plan to layer your paint, where you plan to start, and just in general, the approach you're gonna take for it. Because I guarantee you that little bit of time that you spend doing that is going to make all the difference in the world. So I'm going in with a plan. I'm actually going to dab this with paper towel first, just to knock down some of the solvent a little bit. But I'm going in with a plan of having a gradient from top to bottom, from light to dark, which is exactly what I see in my reference image. And so I've started with a wash with a little bit of solvent on my brush and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And the next thing I'm going to do is start to build that gradient. And I want to do this as fast as I can while still being as accurate as possible. So to help the paint go a little bit smoother on the canvas, I still have some of that solvent on my brush, but not so much that it's dripping down. And I'm also aware that there's some tooth on my canvas. I'm using an Artifacts all-in panel. It's an oil primed panel which has just a nice bit of tooth to the linen, and yet it's smooth enough with that priming that I can still push the paint around fairly easily. So that definitely helps me to know in advance just how my brush, and I'm using a bristle brush, just how my brush is going to react to the canvas and how that's going to mix and blend with my paints. And that's one more reason why these 20-minute studies are so fantastic. I just cannot tell you enough or emphasize enough how great these are, just for learning your materials, getting to know your materials really, really well, So it's so crucial and such a time saver in the end, because once you know how things are going to behave on your surface, then you're free to think about composition and edges and just all the other fun things that make a painting a painting. So here we go. We're doing the water. I've added some white to my mixture, which you can see it's creating a more opaque feeling to the paint. And I do have a gradient there, which I will continue to add to as I add details. Now, because I have a limited palette here, I'm not going to get the exact color blue of the sky, but you can see from the reference photo that that blue is quite a bit different from the blue of the water. And so in order to reflect that, I'm going to do something that some of you might think is a little scary. I'm starting with white. I'm adding ultramarine, and then I'm taking the tiniest dab of my yellow to warm up my blue. And what that's going to do is it's going to create enough of a color change in my sky that it differentiates itself from the ocean. And look, it doesn't look too green. The trick is to make sure you start with your white and then gradually add in your other tinting colors, the blue and the yellow. And the yellow is just, like I said, the tiniest amount. So test it on your palette first, and then test a little section on your painting. And if that looks okay, then have at it. Go to town. So we've got our sky, we've got some ocean. What if we add a little bit of yellow to that ocean blue? Not too much. We don't want it to be overly green. And I want to be careful that I'm not making the value darker than what I've already put up there. So that's pretty close right there. It's pretty consistent with the value I started with, but it's just the tiniest bit more yellow in there. Keep in mind when you're adding yellow to blue, and I mean the local color is absolutely blue, you're thinking about color as not the color yellow, but as an element to help warm up the temperature of the color. And if you think of it that way, it helps prevent you from adding too much of that color, because we're just simply warming it up. We're not changing it to green, if that makes sense. So we're about 5 minutes in, and I'm using the shapes of the water to draw my design, and I'll go in with my darks after this. But right now I'm just kind of testing the water, pun kind of intended, just to see where these shapes are going to land. Now, my composition is not going to match exactly the reference photo. My reference photo is more square than this 5x7 canvas that I have, and so it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be an exact copy, but I'm looking at this as more of a color study and really just an experiment to see how the most effective order of laying the paint down and the order of the shapes and all that, how is that going to play out? If I were to do a larger painting of this, would this approach work? So I'm finding that out as I go, and so far, I don't know, I kind of like this plan. I like that I have that underpainting in there, and that's already starting to set up and dry a little bit because it was so thinned down with the solvent. And then I've got plenty to work with, and I don't have this scary white canvas anymore. So pay attention here. What I'm actually doing is creating a drawing, or I'm drawing with negative space instead of with lines or outlining. And what that's doing, it's giving me plenty of leeway for playing with edges, changing the shapes if I need to. And already you can see the shapes of the rocks there just from that negative space of the water. So here I've added yellow on purpose to make it more green because the reflection of that rock is definitely on the greenish side. And I'm testing it out to see if that's the correct value. I'm still using my bristle brush, but I'm going to go ahead and switch to my soft flat brush here. Time is ticking, you guys. And I'm going to start, this is really important, pushing my darkest darks and my lightest lights. And when I squint at my image, I see the darkest darks as kind of the base of these rocks, and then maybe some of these rocks that are a little bit closer and smaller, closer to the water and just further down. And the higher the rock gets, the lighter it gets in value because it's got some light starting to hit it. So keeping that in mind, that even the rocks have a gradient of their own, especially this main one, which is definitely our focal point. Why is it our focal point? Well, it feels kind of obvious because it's got that bright sunlight on it, but I'll let you in on a little secret. I actually took this reference photo into Photoshop and I exaggerated those values and those gradients even more in Photoshop so that I'd be able to see them better while I'm painting. And yes, you can do that. It is okay to manipulate your reference photos and change the design or change the colors if you feel that it serves the work. So I give you guys permission to do that. I mean, I do it all the time, and sometimes it doesn't even seem like I'm doing enough, you know? If the point of painting is to take something that we see and make it a beautiful interpretation of our experience and possibly make it even better than the real thing, I mean, depending on your subjective perspective, of course, then why not? I mean, why not make those changes? So I'm a big fan of Photoshop to help me envision what the painting could look like and all the possibilities. And historically, you know, that's what sketching and thumbnails were for, right? So now we have all of these wonderful tools at our disposal that we can use instead of, or rather in addition to sketching. I mean, I wouldn't replace it entirely because sketching has so many wonderful merits of its own, but we have all these wonderful things that we can use, all of these great tools, except I gotta get a move on here. So I'm gonna think in terms of larger planes now, and I'm gonna follow the direction of those rocks. They're kind of sloping down at this wonderful diagonal. And I'm gonna use this broad, flat side of my brush to get as much paint up there as possible and really nail in that shape. Of course, all of those little smaller rocks are not going to be as important in the end. And if you think about it, it's really just detail work. The main idea is that we are honing in on that gradient from light to dark, top to bottom, and we are getting our main shapes, our main players. And if I'm lucky, maybe I'll even get that sailboat in there. I'm just gonna pace myself accordingly. I want to make sure that I am just putting in the most pertinent and important information and that I'm doing it as accurately as possible. And what that requires of us is to pick at our paintings a whole lot less and think more in terms of how can I lay down that information with just one or two brush strokes. For me, a painting is worth continuing or worth blowing up into a larger scene if it holds my interest and attention the entire time that I'm working on it. That's kind of what it requires. If I get bored with it, that's a problem. And that either means that my composition was too weak to start, or it's possible that my energy was really low that day and maybe I just need to come back and give it a second chance on another day. But usually it has to do with composition. And composition is what draws us into the painting from across the room. It's the first thing that catches our eye, or doesn't catch our eye if it's something weak. So with this one, I was really intentional about making sure that I had a very clear focal point. The light on that rock, it's just magnificent, really early morning sunshine. And then we've got another psychological focal point, and that's that little sailboat off in the distance. You kind of notice that after the fact, after you see the rocks here. All right, let's go into that main rock. We're going to take some of this yellow, mix some of that blue in there, which I'm almost out of blue already. I thought I had enough on my palette. It turns out I've been using it pretty much for the entire painting. So that's another thing that you can do to plan ahead, is just make sure that you have enough paint on your palette for the mixtures that you're going to be making. So I'm going to take a little bit of black and blue, mix that with my yellow. You can get a couple different shades of yellow that way. The black gives you an earthier yellow-green, and then the blue gives you more of a true green when you mix it with that yellow. And both of them are lovely to play around with. And here's where the warm gray is going to come in. I love this color for landscapes. I just find that it is such a great color to come back to. You can use it for warm or cool depending on the context. And it's such a wonderful value as well for highlights or middle values. You can use it to lighten a dark, or you can use it to darken a highlight. And so it's extremely versatile. And I keep finding it on my palette more and more. Let's play up some of those greens up here and just really glob the paint on thicker in there so that you can tell that there's moss and life on that rock, and that's where the sun is hitting it quite directly. And then I can take one of my smaller brushes. If I feel like my brushwork starts to get a little clunky, I can take a smaller brush and knock down some of those ridges and change up some of those edges here and there to give it a bit more variety in the brushwork. Now, as we come down to where that shape is moving into shadow, I'm going to pull in some of that burnt sienna and some blue to give myself a darker gray here, which looks beautiful as it transitions into the shadow. Gorgeous. Oh, this is getting me excited about doing this painting bigger. And you know, I was hesitant about the shape of the rock. It feels very blocky to me. But there again, you know, that's still something you could change. Doesn't have to be the exact same rock. Although someone living in this part of the country would possibly recognize it. It's a risk I'm willing to take for the sake of making a great painting, you know. Now, does it look flat enough? If not, you can start making some of those broader strokes again down that rock shape, kind of like I did on the one that's in shadow over here. And speaking of that other rock, let's give that some light up here too, which I also don't know if you can tell from the photo, but I added that in with Photoshop because I felt like it needed something. Like I didn't want that big rock to be the only shape that was completely in the light. So I wanted just a hint of light coming through elsewhere. So we're going to pretend that this rock has some on it as well. And then when you put those lights in, that also gives it some extra added dimension. It suggests, you know, some of those shapes, those crevices and points within the rock itself, which is a wonderful detail. Now, if I were to do this painting larger, I would definitely want maybe a phthalo blue in there at some point, because the blue down here is just so blue, and I do feel like I'm kind of missing out on that. And then I want to make this reflection. Let's switch to the bigger brush again. I want to make sure this reflection is dark enough down here so that we get a really nice transition from the rock to the water. And you can move your brush back and forth to get the feeling of ripples and waves in the water. You can pick at it for hours, but we gotta hustle, we gotta move on. 2 minutes to go. I think that's just enough time to put in our little sailboat. But first I want to straighten my horizon line here. Nothing worse than a crooked horizon line. And if it means coming in with some more paint, so be it. I like to approach it from the bottom so that my hand can rest on either a mahl stick or on the surface of my easel, just to keep it steady, to get that nice straight line. And as you can see, I still don't have it, but I will, don't worry. Although it's not going to be perfect if I hope to get that sailboat in. And I know you guys are waiting for that. All right, so let's do it. I'm going to grab my tiniest brush. I'm going to grab some pure white here, and looking carefully at where that boat is, how big it is. It's almost like target practice. Got to be so careful with those straight lines. Okay, not too bad. And just a little bit of a base there for our boat. Yeah. Okay, and time's up. That was 20 minutes. Every time I do this, I'm surprised at how fast it goes. Every time, and I've done so many of these, but it's great because it never gets old. So give this one a try. It was a lot of fun.